As an American, the prospect of Puerto Rican statehood has always really fascinated me. I wrote a paper and did a speech on potential Puerto Rican statehood about 4 years ago when I was in 11th grade, and since I know a few Puerto Rican families here in Texas, I've been able to get a good grip on how they feel about the issue, and I'm going to be giving an objective analysis of the movement, and please feel free to share your personal thoughts down below. So, how would this affect the area, population, and economy of the United States? Well, the area of Puerto Rico is about 3,400 square miles, which would make it about the same size as Connecticut or the country of Trinidad, which is also in the Caribbean. And so that would make it one of the smallest countries by land area. Wouldn't really affect the land size of the United States, although it would give us a strategic position in the Caribbean along with the U.S. Virgin Islands, which also might be tempted to join as the 52nd state, or more likely would simply latch onto Puerto Rico and join as the 51st state. And for those of you who don't know, the U.S. Virgin Islands are literally right next to Puerto Rico, so it would make sense. The population in 2010 was about 3.7 million, which would be a bit higher than its ranking for area at 30th, which coincidentally is also about the same size as Connecticut, and Connecticut is also about the same shape as Puerto Rico. And coincidentally again, Connecticut has the largest Puerto Rican percentage in the mainland United States. The population density is just way more populous than pretty much any state, 971 people per square mile, which would make it third in the United States after New Jersey and Rhode Island. So basically imagine the suburbs of like New York City or Dallas or somewhere like that. That's how densely populated Puerto Rico is everywhere. And the GDP is about 126 billion, or about the same as Washington D.C. or the state of Arkansas, and the per capita is 35,000 per person, which is really low for the US standards, about 49th, which is a little bit over Mississippi, which is currently the poorest state in the US. But keep in mind that this GDP per capita rate is still one of the highest in the Caribbean and Latin America. Although, like the rest of Latin America, there's a huge divide between rich and poor, and almost half the population of Puerto Rico lives below the poverty level at $20,000 a year. Now, the population of Puerto Rico is falling very quickly. It was 3.8 million in 2000, but because of emigration and lowering birth rates, it's predicted to drop, or it has dropped to 3.4 million in 2016, a drop of 400,000 people, and it's predicted to drop to 2.2 million by 2050. So that's almost a drop of half in 50 years. Now, there are many reasons for this population drop. Most Puerto Ricans moved to the mainland United States, and the fertility is also incredibly small, especially for Latin American countries. There are 5.4 million people with at least some Puerto Rican ancestry in mainland United States, and almost all of them live in New York, especially New York City, Florida, mostly in Miami or Orlando, as well as New Jersey, New England, Pennsylvania, and Hawaii, believe it or not. And that's a bit of an interesting story that I'll leave for later. There's about 1.5 times as many Puerto Ricans in the U.S. than in Puerto Rico itself. So if all Puerto Ricans were to move back to Puerto Rico, the island's population would be over 9 million people, if you can imagine that. So it would be, well, it's still the fourth largest territory in the Caribbean after Cuba, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic, but it would sort of be on par with Cuba. So if you can imagine the entire population of Cuba fitting into Puerto Rico, that's what it would be like. Now, a lot of people are complaining that this would just totally screw up the racial makeup of the United States, totally throw it out of whack, but it wouldn't really change much, to be honest. Racial identification in Puerto Rico is very confusing, to say the least. There are three main racial groups on the island. You have self-identified whites, blacks, and mixed race, who primarily identify as mulatto, although they do have significant Native American genetic input as well, and giving it a very similar makeup to the country of Cuba. Although about 75% of Puerto Ricans identify as white on the island of Puerto Rico, on average, these white Puerto Ricans have about 10 to 20% non-European admixture, mostly African, Amerindian, and even Middle Eastern, since many Canarians from Spain had migrated to the island during the Spanish period. So a lot of Americans wouldn't consider white Puerto Ricans to actually be white or European. But in Latin America, Puerto Ricans are considered to be one of the whitest Latin American countries. No, the percentage of Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico that identify as white or black lines up almost identically with that of the U.S. population as a whole, seeing how it's about 70% white and 12% black. So admitting Puerto Rico as a state literally wouldn't change the racial makeup of the U.S. on the census at all. For Puerto Ricans in the continental United States, though, it's a completely different situation, as most Puerto Ricans outside of Puerto Rico identify as multiracial instead of as white, even though the average racial gene pool of Puerto Rican Americans is about the same as that in Puerto Rico, which just goes to show that racial identification is a bit subjective depending on where you are. If Puerto Rico was a state, it would be by far the most religious state, with around 96% of Puerto Ricans identifying as Christians, with around 2/3 of those being Catholic and the rest being Protestant, which would also make it the most Catholic state in the United States. Although Puerto Rico has been a Commonwealth of the United States for over 100 years, its population is still overwhelmingly Spanish-speaking, with only 5% being native English speakers, and that'll probably be the biggest obstacle to statehood. So it would probably force parts of the United States government to implement Spanish as well as English. Now, as most people know, Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico cannot vote for president in the general election, although they can vote in the presidential primaries, which is a bit odd. Although as soon as Puerto Ricans step foot onto any of the other 50 states, they are allowed to vote. And for the most part, Puerto Rico is very left-leaning in pretty much every way, and a lot of people claim that if Puerto Rico was a state, it would vote Democrat for president pretty much every time, guaranteed. And they're 100% correct. In the 2016 election, about 75% of Puerto Ricans in the continental United States voted for the Democratic candidate, while about 18% voted Republican, and the other 7% voted for a third party. So most likely Puerto Rico as a state would vote somewhere around this percentage, with Democrat being about probably 3-1. Although in the last presidential primary, the ratio of people that voted in the Democratic primary versus Republican primary, which is also a fairly accurate way of predicting party affiliation in a state, it was a bit more balanced at about 2-1, meaning that twice as many people voted in the Democratic primary as opposed to the Republican primary. And the winner of the Democratic primary was Hillary Clinton, and the Republican primary was Marco Rubio, which would make sense seeing how Rubio is also of Hispanic Caribbean descent, although I have heard that Cubans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans don't really get along in the United States, which is kind of surprising to me. Although the Puerto Rican lady I was talking to was a bit on the older side, so maybe the situation has improved since. For those of you who don't know, Dominicans and Puerto Ricans are the largest Hispanic communities in New York City. So occasionally the communities do have some clashes, and Cubans and Puerto Ricans are the largest communities, Hispanic communities in Florida. Either way, it would be really interesting to see a 51st state, whether it's Puerto Rico or Guam or Saudi Arabia, and I'm sure you guys would like to share your opinions in the comments, so let me know what you think of Puerto Rico becoming a U.S. state, maybe even with the U.S. Virgin Islands also tagging along, and that would sort of increase their ratio of people that speak English in the state. And tell me how you think it would impact the U.S. and other areas like the Caribbean, Latin America, and also the other much smaller U.S. territories in the Pacific, like Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands. Some people say that they might also want to become a state if Puerto Rico becomes a state. So let me know your thoughts on that. As always, thanks for watching, everyone. This has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.